Anchor, Chapter 4. Typically, Blake would shut her phone off before going to bed each night. Irrational anxiety over the phone ringing would seep into her nightmares too often when she left it on. Even off, she still dreaded the thought that somehow, somewhen, her phone would ring and ring and ring. She feared the constant beeps of ceaseless texts. That had been Adam's way. Going to work, she would always know that he'd sent her texts to supposedly check in on her. There would be voicemails on top of the texts, and she knew that opening them was a gamble. She never knew which side of Adam would rear its ugly head in those messages. She was asleep when her phone beeped with a text. Blake shot up, panicked for a moment before remembering herself. She was on the sofa, in a tiny rural town, far away from Kuakwana and the man imprisoned there. She hadn't shut her phone off, she realized. After taking her sleeping pill, she could recall the conscious decision she'd made to leave it on. She and Yang had been texting, and even after Yang's last "Have a good night, sweetheart," she hadn't wanted to turn it off, just in case she'd sent another. Which she apparently did that morning. "Good morning. Didn't want to text you too early. Didn't want to wake you." Smiley face. Yang's message read. Blake smiled. "You didn't," she replied. She smoothed a hand over the sweatshirt she still wore. It had been broken in and well-loved, making it the perfect material to sleep in. Was it weird to enjoy having this little essence of Yang with her? "I'm going to be stuck at work all day, but I'd love it if you could stop by." Blake considered. "You're up early," Callie remarked, sounding surprised as she stepped into the living room from the kitchen. Blake set her phone down, trying not to look too guilty. "I slept well," she said with a shrug. One of Callie's ears twitched. "Are you sure your friend isn't going to mind you sleeping in their sweatshirt?" she asked, and like the night before, Blake caught the barest suspicion in her mother's eyes. "I'll wash it before I return it. It was cold last night." "Uh-huh." Callie didn't seem to buy it, but she let the subject go. "Dad and I are going to head out to New Harbor. They've got an old fort, a beach, a lighthouse. Want to come?" "I think I'll pass this time." Blake pressed the button to wake her phone up again, still open to Yang's offer. "I might visit the shipyard again." Callie regarded Blake for a moment. Her golden eyes narrowed. She wasn't the type to miss anything, and Blake held her breath. "I suppose," she finally said. She smiled, a light and easy thing that made Blake wonder if the suspicion had been there at all. It was entirely possible that the paranoia was winning again. "I'm so glad you're coming out of your shell a little bit. The people here are nice." Which was the truth. None of the people she'd met so far had seemed like bad people. Some were just nicer than others. Her mind raced back to Yang, the careful touches she'd given Blake, and how each one meant something. "That makes it easier, I guess. Mind dropping me off before you head out?" "Sure thing." Callie paused, her looking turning uncertain. Blake felt her hackles rise. You're not seeing someone, are you?" "Mom!" Callie regarded her warily, taking in the bright red of Blake's cheeks and the way her ears fell flat on her scalp. "Just please be careful, Blake. It's hardly been a month since—" "God, Mom, I know!" Blake covered her eyes with one of her hands, not wanting this conversation to happen. "Do you think I just forgot?" "I didn't say—" "I'm being careful! Can't you just trust me?" She looked back up at Callie, and was dismayed that her mother only looked away, not answering. Still, an hour later, she was deposited at the entrance of Xiaolong shipyard. Before they pulled away, Gira extracted a promise from Blake to show them around the place one of these days. As if Blake knew anything about the sprawling buildings or the boats that were sprinkled throughout the property, he seemed unaware of the tension between his wife and daughter, and Blake was grateful that Callie had said nothing to him about that morning. She was being careful, wasn't she? "Excuse me," she called out, knocking on the door of the main office. "I'm looking for Yang Xiaolong." She didn't really need an introduction to the woman who answered. Weiss Schnee, co-pilot of Crescent Rose, looked up from her paper-strewn desk with a piercing stare. She frowned. "I'm sorry?" she asked. "Can I ask who—" "Blake," she replied quickly, wincing. Already she was making a fool of herself, and Weiss's pale eyebrow shot up. "I'm Blake, and Yang said I could—" "Oh!" Weiss said, some kind of realization dawning. "Belladonna." She rolled her eyes. "I had to listen to Yang going on and on about your date all morning. Of course she invited you here." Weiss made no mention of how Blake's face went scarlet as she pushed herself away from the desk. She gave Blake a once-over, eyes lingering on the ears at the top of her head. "She didn't mention you were a faunus," she remarked, surprised. But Blake was relieved to see there was no disgust in that surprise. She spent a few more seconds looking her over, then stood up and extended a hand. "Weiss Schnee, I do accounting, but I'm also the receptionist. I'm the only responsible person in this whole shipyard, I guess." Blake stared for a minute, but Weiss's mouth creased with a hidden smile. A joke. Blake relaxed, then shook her hand. And I guess you know who I am already. Are you kidding? She groaned. Ruby's bad enough on her own, but she at least moves on to other things. Yang, though? She shook her head, her white ponytail bouncing. She won't stop. She led a still blushing Blake out of the office down the dirt road. Instead of veering right toward the docks that she'd visited the other day, Weiss steered her to the left. A massive, disused building blocked them from whatever lay beyond, but Weiss picked out the worn trail around it. Did Ruby give you the grand tour last time? She asked, catching the way Blake stared, wide-eyed at the building and various boats that were propped up around them. No, I think she just wanted to show me Crescent Rose, she replied, looking up at a large blue-hulled boat propped up on its legs. Semblance was written on the back in gold cursive. This is pretty cool. I guess it is for tourists. Weiss's casual snobbery was almost amusing. She didn't even seem to have noticed her own patronizing tone. I've been coming here every summer since I was a kid, and moved here after college. I practically grew up here. So you knew Yang growing up? Unfortunately. She's the reason I needed stitches when I was 12. Weiss sighed dramatically. We were fooling around on a boat that definitely wasn't done yet. And, well, she kicked up a leg, showing off a long scar on her calf. I thought Dad was going to sue this place. She's got a pretty big one on her arm, too. Must be a theme here, Blake said, amused. Weiss scrunched up her face, looking more uncomfortable than annoyed now. That was... yeah, Weiss trailed off, fidgeting with the collar of her shirt. Blake looked over, frowning. There was something she was missing, or something being hidden, but before she could address it, Weiss plowed on. This one on my eye, though? This wasn't Yang's fault, actually. I got this on one of Dad's fishing trips when... Oh! Yang, you've got a visitor! Blake almost jumped, looking around. Oh, hey, awesome! Yang's cheerful voice came from above, in a boat that Blake hadn't caught the name of. I'll be right down! Blake watched with raised eyebrows as Yang shimmied along the deck of the boat above her, swinging a leg over the side and coming down a ladder that stood beside it. There was a sheen of sweat on her arms and forehead, and the blonde wisps that had escaped her messy bun had plastered against her temples. How's she coming? Weiss asked, setting a hand on her hip to give the boat a critical eye. Slowly but surely. Glad you decided to stop by, Blake. Yang rubbed her palms on her thighs, drying off the sweat before throwing her arms around her. A hug. Such a simple gesture, and one she had wondered how it would feel to receive from Yang, but Blake still gave a violent twitch in response. She sensed Yang's surprise as the taller woman nearly released her, which wasn't what she wanted. So Blake made the quick decision to return the embrace, uncaring of Yang's sweat-drenched shirt. Yang's arms wrapped back around her more gently, and in the space of a few seconds they had found their balance. It was too brief. Yang pulled away, grinning, looking happy, genuinely happy to see her. I would have brought your sweatshirt, but it probably needs to be washed first, Blake told her, but Yang was already shaking her head. I told you, you look better in it anyway. Yang pulled a purple bandana from where it had been dangling from her pocket to wipe her forehead. You can have it. God, it's hot. I can't just take it, Blake protested, but Yang only huffed and crammed the bandana back into her pocket. Sure you can, unless you really want to fight me for it. To make a point, Yang stretched out her arms over her head, muscles rippling with the motion. Blake nearly gaped, but caught herself before she was too obvious. God, Yang, leave her alone! Blake almost jumped. She'd nearly forgotten about Weiss, who was giving Yang a disbelieving stare. Blake, just keep the sweatshirt. It'll end up a rag if you don't anyway. Just like other clothes she's borrowed from people. She glared pointedly at Yang, whose eyes widened innocently. What? I'd never do such a thing. Yang gave Blake a quick wink. And even if it did, it was only once. 3 times, Yang! I can make you an itemized list of all of my things that have ended up covered in grease. Ugh, accountants, Yang wrinkled her nose. They make lists for everything. We have to when dealing with people like you. But to be fair, I can't be held responsible for that ugly cardigan you had. That was all on RWBY. I wasn't including it, you buffoon! Blake watched the exchange with amusement, surprised when Weiss actually lifted a leg and stomped her foot on that last word. Yang was snorting with laughter. But you knew exactly what sweater I was talking about, though, she declared, pumping a fist in victory. You knew it was ugly. So? My style was questionable at times, Weiss replied hotly with an embarrassed scowl. It was Goodwill chick, Yang mock whispered to Blake, who grinned. Only a rich kid from Massachusetts would think thrift store clothes are edgy. Oh, you are such a bitch! Weiss stared at the pair of them for a minute, and then shook her head with a slow, grudging smile. Anyway, I gotta get back to work. It was nice meeting you, Blake. I'm sure I'll see you around. If you ask her real nice, I bet she'll come to the race next week, Yang told her, shoving both hands in her pockets, still grinning. What's the point if you're planning on doing that yourself? Weiss shot back, eyebrows raised. Blake bit her lip to keep from smiling, at least until Weiss had turned her back and was walking away. Then the grin took over her face. The Ice Queen does make a point, Yang said when Weiss was out of earshot. What are you doing next Thursday? It sounds like I'm going to another race with you. Blake thanked whatever gods were on her side that she was able to speak without her voice trembling or cracking. She almost sounded smooth. Yang snorted. Well, I was going to ask first, but yeah, if you want to. Yang's boisterous grin changed, then dropping into something smaller, softer. She was offering an out, Blake realized. There would be no tricks into a date, no bullying her into saying yes. This was Blake's choice, and Yang wasn't going to assume anything. It was a relief to hear, even if she knew it didn't change her answer. I would love to, Blake replied, even more confident in her answer than she was before. So, are you building this? What? Yang looked back at the boat she'd been working on, as if surprised to even see it at all. Blake suppressed a smile. Oh, nah, just making some improvements to the mast, and then I need to put this anti-corrosion stuff on. Not as exciting as building a whole new boat, but it's just as important. Oh, I get that. Yang led her around the boat, Blake admiring it politely. She didn't know anything about boats. It was bigger than Crescent Rose, but bulkier. She guessed it probably wasn't made for racing. It was beautiful, though. Someone had put a lot of care into the words "Due Gale" that glittered on the back. It makes sense. Yeah, Yang stepped back, looking up to the large hull with a pleased look. I mean, I love building boats too. But we don't just build, Yang explained, gesturing to the boat above them. We fix things too, so I guess I'm like a boat mechanic or something. Boat builder does roll off the tongue a little more nicely. Blake shook her head, amused, then muttered, boat mechanic. It was close enough to lunchtime that Yang didn't go through the trouble of getting Blake up onto the boat itself. Yang hopped back up to wrap up whatever she was working on. After lunch, Yang assured her, she'd haul Blake up and really teach her a few things about boats. I'd take you up to the Leviathan for lunch, but they'll take too long. It's easier to just go back to the house to eat, Yang called down. She peeked over the edge, as if to make sure Blake hadn't suddenly left her, then added, I know leftovers aren't really romantic, but I just made the chili yesterday for RWBY, and it's pretty good. Chili sounds fine. How hot is it? Not very. Yang had gone back to her tools, so Blake couldn't see her face, but she heard the smile. We're Mainers. We're wimps when it comes to spice. That's okay. I can handle spice, but I don't like it when there's too much. I'm sure your chili is perfect. Yang swung back over the edge, the height of the ladder not even an issue to someone who was so used to it. Blake knew she'd make a fool of herself if she tried to climb it, but she'd cross that bridge when she got to it. No wonder Yang had been up and down that rock so easily on race day. The house was on shipyard property, making the walk there quick. Though large, the walls made the space seemed closed off and almost cramped. Blake was used to the open concept houses of Menagerie and, to a lesser extent, some of the more modern homes in Vale. The Xiaolong house was much older and boxier than many of those houses, but it was quite cozy. Yang led her through the entryway and past a staircase to the kitchen. It was dated, with aged linoleum and walls that were painted an uncomfortable green. At least the pictures were cute, Blake thought with a small smile. Two little girls sat on a yellow lobster trap, big grins plastered on their faces. The blonde was in pigtails, her smile wide enough to show a missing tooth. The other girl, darker of hair, looked to be trying to pull herself up from the opening she'd been set in. Blake's eyes flicked back over to the grown Yang, who was pulling gaudy blue bowls out of a cupboard. It was easy to see how the little pig-tailed girl had grown into this woman. She had all her teeth now, but she still smiled with the same creases in her cheeks. How much do you want? Yang asked, pulling a container from the fridge. Probably not too much. She didn't have much of an appetite these days, but Blake was curious about Yang's cooking. Chili probably wasn't the best sort of meal for a hot summer day, but it was hearty and delicious, thick with beans and beef and corn. Yang had sprinkled enough cheese on her own bowl that it melted into an unappetizing-looking glob. Blake finished her bowl quickly and surprised herself by asking for another helping. I didn't expect it to be that good, she admitted when Yang returned with a fresh bowl. That'll teach you to doubt me, Yang replied, smugly, lifting her spoon. The cheese hung off her spoon in long strings, and Yang cut them off with her tongue before taking a bite of her chili. Anytime you want to come over for dinner, just let me know. I might have to now. And the idea was tempting. Lunch with Yang was more pleasant and much more animated than the sullen meal she shared with her folks. She couldn't bring herself to talk as much as Yang did, but Blake was slowly figuring out the mechanics of conversation again. It had been crippled by the time she'd spent with Adam, when she'd carefully censor every word that came out of her mouth. It wasn't necessary here. With Yang, conversation could be unfiltered again. God, I'm stuffed. Blake stood up, grabbing her own bowl and the one Yang had pushed away when she'd finished. No, I got that, Yang said, jumping up to take the bowls from her. She didn't even give Blake a chance before taking them to the sink. You sure? Blake frowned. They're only dishes. I'm a big girl, Blake. I think I can handle it. Yang gave her a wink, and Blake had no choice but to back down. I know, but you took care of the lunch part. I'm not used to just sitting around and letting someone else do all the work. She got up, going over to the sink to watch Yang rinse the bowls. There were splotches of cheese stuck to Yang's, which required a little more scrubbing. Blake ran a finger between the green tiles of the countertop absently. Even if the work only takes a couple minutes? Yang asked, a grin playing on her lips again. Sure enough, once she'd stuck the bowls in the dishwasher, she was done. It's not that. I just don't want you to think I'm... she said, but hesitated before she could finish her thought. Lazy. She heard Adam whisper in her ear. She grimaced. Her train of thought had crashed with that small, remembered word. Fighting the sinking of her heart, she scraped one of her fingernails into the grout a little harder than she intended. She shook her head, keeping her eyes trained on the countertop. Sorry. It's okay. Yang had dried her hands off with a dishcloth before turning to lean against the counter. Everything all right? Yeah. She wasn't going to say anything. She didn't want to talk about this ever again. But Yang was looking at her with such concern that she scooted just a little closer, sheltered into the protective glow that Yang seemed to emit. If they were going to spend much more time together, then maybe Yang deserved to hear the truth. At least the beginning of it. She scraped at the grout more intensely, her fingers full of nervous energy. I just got out of a relationship, and it was bad. Bad? Yang repeated. Blake couldn't tell which one of them had moved. They were so close now, almost touching. Bad. She frowned at the floor. I'm just still trying to get over that. I was with him for years, and a lot of stuff happened. I get it. Blake was still working on the grout, but stopped when Yang lay her fingers on her hand. Was he the one who did this to you? Yang didn't need to gesture for Blake to know that she was talking about her ribs. She nodded, and a dark cloud fell over Yang's face. Her grip over Blake's hand tightened only slightly. How fucking dare he? She growled. He's in jail now, Blake said quickly, not wanting to stir up anger over nothing. It's just hard to get used to. Life without all of that. She tried to soften her frown. It felt as though her face had frozen it in place. So, I'm sorry if I don't know. I just, get weird about it sometimes, and it's okay, baby, I get it, Yang said reassuringly, her rough fingers ghosting over Blake's knuckles. I really do. And she sounded like she meant it. Blake closed the small fraction of space between them, not drawing back when her body slid into place beside Yang's. They fit the way a doorknob clicked into the jamb, secured and immovable. Yang's hand moved around Blake's back, slowly giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. Blake blew out a breath, her body relaxing as she sunk against Yang's frame. For the second time that day, both of Yang's arms were around her, and Blake buried her face in Yang's shoulder, breathing in unfamiliar smells of the shipyard and the more comforting scent of Yang herself. She had missed a touch like this. Even Adam couldn't have beaten this need out of her, and she was starved for this gentle touch. She just hadn't been able to identify that need before. One of Yang's hands traced her spine, slowly ascending over each curve. Her body, trained to brace itself against any touch, surrendered more and more of its tension until she'd practically melted into Yang. For such calloused hands, Yang's touch was achingly tender on her back. "Wanna just sit down for a bit? I've got some time before I need to get back," Yang murmured. She paused, then added quickly, "Not to... I mean just sit. We can just sit, or watch TV or something." "Okay," Blake breathed. She was loath to let go, and Yang seemed to feel the same way. Her hand trailed away from Blake slowly, fingers lingering longer than they had to. Yang laced her fingers through hers, leading her away from the counter and out of the kitchen. The living room was further down the hall, and Blake was so focused on the warmth of Yang's grip that she didn't pay attention to the photos on the wall at first. At one, however, she stopped, and Yang came to a halt when Blake did. "Is this Hugh?" Blake asked with a small smile, nodding at a family portrait. 4 people, sitting in the grass under a tree, surrounded by wildfires. A yellow-haired toddler in a lavender dress was standing at her father's shoulder, grinning so widely that her eyes crinkled into narrow slits. The woman beside her father looked so much like Ruby that it was obvious that this was their mother. She couldn't remember if anyone had told her the woman's name, but if they had, she couldn't remember it. In the woman's arms was a baby who couldn't have possibly been over a year old, with a nimbus of dark hair. Ruby. "This is absolutely adorable." "I was a pretty cute kid," Yang replied, her voice light. Blake looked up at her, but her smile faded when she saw Yang wasn't even looking at the picture. She was looking at the blank wall over it, face pleasantly blank. For someone who had such open facial expressions, it was so strange to see it so carefully neutral. Yang's free hand rubbed absently at the scar on her arm. "I guess you took after your dad, huh?" Yang asked, watching for any kind of reaction. There was none. Yang only shrugged. "Well, Summer wasn't really my biological mom. But that's kind of a complicated story. I'll tell you sometime." Not once had Yang's eyes looked to the picture, but she dropped her hand away from her scar. "Here, the living room's just around here." The topic was closed. The small indents of nails Yang had left behind on the puckered scar tissue spoke volumes, but Blake didn't press the topic further. She didn't want to risk ruining this, whatever this was, with inappropriate questions about something Yang clearly didn't want to talk about. She did, however, give Yang's hand a quick squeeze. Yang returned it, a small smile returning to her face. On the couch, Blake settled back into Yang's arms, as if she'd never left. Had she ever been held like this? She couldn't remember the last time she felt so comfortable with someone. There had been times Adam had held her, but Blake had always feared that those moments would come with a price, that affection would turn to pain. But this... She curled her body under Yang's arm, closing her eyes. This was nice. This was safe. This was peaceful. "Are you sure this is okay?" Blake asked. Insecurity was never far away. "More than." Yang's fingertips strummed her back. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," she replied softly. She slid a hand around Yang's stomach and waist, muscles tight under her arm. Her own heart was pounding hard throughout her body. How could Yang not feel it? It's okay. When it's you." Yang's grip tightened slightly, and Blake found herself wiggling even closer. They didn't need words as the minutes passed. All Blake needed was Yang's rhythmic breaths and the occasional whistle of the wind outside. If she could have stayed there forever, she might have even been convinced it was heaven. It was Yang who broke the silence. "I don't want to do anything you don't want to do," she said, voice low. Blake nodded, unsure of what to say to that. "I want you to be able to trust me." Oh, she had promised her mother that she was being careful, but this conversation was already treading a dangerous line. She knew, more than anyone, that not everyone could be trusted, not even the people closest to her. She learned that the hard way. Would Yang snap like Adam had, taking her trust and manipulating it until she couldn't remember who she was? But Adam had never been as gentle as Yang was. Even at the beginning, when Blake had been infatuated with his intelligence and ideals, there had always been a razor to his tongue, and his temper had been a match, ready to strike at any moment. His monster was always lurking just under the surface. At the time, Blake had thought it was only a deadliness that would power his passions, that could be channeled for good. But his monster was still a monster, no matter the pretty picture he tried to paint on it. There were no sharp edges to Yang's personality. Even in the way she interacted with Ruby and Weiss, everything had been transparent. It would be so easy to trust that. But she couldn't, not yet. So even as she lay in the crook of Yang's body, she had to remind herself to be careful. But her heart yearned for connection. Yang was already bringing light to her blackened soul. She craved more. "Then don't let me go yet," she replied, close to a whimper. Yang wrapped her other arm around her, shifting her own body to pull Blake closer and resting her chin on her head. At this angle, Blake could hear Yang's steady heartbeat against her ear. Getting up was harder than she had imagined, but Blake didn't want to be the cause of Yang's tardiness. They pried themselves apart regretfully. Soon, Blake told herself, even if she wasn't sure she believed it. They'd be able to do this again soon. "As long as my hours even out in the end, it doesn't really matter if I'm just a little late," Yang assured her as she stood up. She pulled her hair out of its bun, shook out the messy blonde locks, and fixed it into a ponytail. "Plus, it helps when your dad's the boss." "That sounds like you're abusing your privilege," Blake remarked with a teasing smile. "Only when pretty girls are involved," Yang winked, then offered a hand. "Come on, I'll give you a real boat education as I work." "Are you turning me into a sailor, Zhao Long?" Blake asked, taking the hand and letting Yang pull her off the sofa. "I'll try, but I'm not a miracle worker for you landlubbers." "Weren't you a sailing camp counselor? Wasn't it your job to teach kids to sail?" This made Yang laugh. "It didn't mean I was always successful. I may have lost one or two overboard." Was this what a normal relationship was like, holding someone's hand and laughing? It was such a foreign concept, but while Yang led her back down the path to the Dew Gale, Blake could almost forget that Yang had been a stranger only days ago. But she couldn't forget. Always there was that little part of her mind that wondered, was she rushing things? Was she being foolish? And always, 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 Adam's voice whispered its own admonishments in her ear. "Slut," he said. "You okay, sweetheart?" Yang asked, brows furrowed. "You looked a little lost there for a second." Yeah. Blake shook her head, trying to shake the thought from her head. I'm fine. She would be. She had to be. End of chapter.